what is ethics? Everybody has a different definition, a different insight, and a different opinion. And that's good. We're all different. We ought to think differently about things. That's why diversity is so important. But ethics is based on your moral framework. And so it begs the question, what is morals? Well, if ethics is based on what you were trained to be moral, what is right and what is wrong, then you got to define morals first if you want to talk about ethics. And today we're going to talk about cyber ethics, ethics in the digital world. I was a submarine officer for most of my early career, and there was a 3-star admiral that I worked with, Mel Williams. He was born and raised in D.C. His father was a Master Chief Petty Officer of the Navy, and he aspired, when he retired from the Navy, to be an educator. And he went first to George Washington to be a dean, ended up at Catholic University as a dean. He's retired now. But Mel called me up in a panic and said, "Tommy, I need you to help. I got to find somebody who can teach cybersecurity." And what he found was that people that know cybersecurity don't have time to run off and get a PhD, so they're qualified to teach at a graduate level at university, probably because they're making too much money to take time off from a career to do nothing but study for 4 or 5 years. But the people that could teach were busy. There's a lot of demand for people with knowledge like the people in the audience here have. So how do you catch somebody to teach the next generation? Great question, Mel. HP has a policy where they want you to give back to your community. They ask that you spend 4 hours a week in giving back. And I've got coworkers that work in soup kitchens, others that work with places like Habitat for Humanity and build things, can do things with their hands. I certainly can't cook, and I'm terrible doing things with my hands, but I could teach. And so I told Mel I'll be glad to help, but my doctorate was in economics, not in cybersecurity. I've kind of picked that up on the side, mostly because of the studies in economics, and econometrics is what they used to call data science. Large data sets trying to make sense out of a whole bunch of numbers and predict where the economy's going. And so data science led to cyber. And in fact, on my first submarine, I had the opportunity to work on a special project. Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Lab had a top secret project. There was a PDP-8 computer in the middle of the control room on the submarine. And I was taking a course. I would tell you it's an online course. It was just back in 1978, and there wasn't an online. It was a mail order course where you'd fill out the answers to the questions, you'd mail it off, and the next week you'd get your next assignments and your graded exam. And the course was in building a microprocessor. And what you really learned was how to solder a chip on a motherboard. And that was good knowledge, nice to know. But in order to program the chip, you had to know machine language. You had to know binary, so you could actually get it to turn on and execute simple commands. And when the scientists found out that I knew binary, or I could start up a PDP-8. And so as a young ensign in 1978, I got working in classified programs in the digital world, and every submarine I went to ended up with classified programs in the digital space. So I got trained with the School of Hard Knocks and on-the-job training, and Mel knew this, and he said, "You can teach this as good as anybody, and it's always fun teaching a course where the students know more than you do, because you always learn a lot." And he came to me after a couple of years and said, "Catholic is a very ethical institution. There's a religious bias there, and partly because it's funded by the Catholic Church, and it's pretty expensive to go there. I'm Not sure I could have afforded to go, but I really supported their outlook and their agenda, as well as the standards they hold. And they said, can you teach a course on cyber ethics? And I thought, I don't know. I grabbed another classmate from the Naval Academy, Rear Admiral Fred Bias. He had retired as oceanographer of the Navy, but on one of his shore tours, Fred had taught ethics at the Naval Academy, which is a standard course that you take. My professor in ethics when I was a young kid was a commander who had just come back as a prisoner of war from Vietnam, spent 7 years in the Hanoi Hilton. So he'd had plenty of time to think about ethics. Good teacher. But Fred didn't know anything about cyber. I didn't know anything about ethics. But together we crafted this course. So you get a little taste of it today, a little thinking mostly from Fred, a little from me, that talks about how do you think about ethics? How do you know what's right and what's wrong? We have a motto at HP. It came out of our founders 86 years ago. We want our company to do the right thing at the right time. And that's sometimes hard to define, but with that general principle, it helps you make decisions of what's right, what's wrong, what should we be doing. And so I told Catholic I'd see what I could do with Fred's help. I went to Black Hat the next week in Las Vegas, Black Hat, DEF CON conferences, my second most favorite conference behind S4, but that might change in August, because S4 is a great conference. It's been 11 years to this thing. I learn something every time I go. And at Black Hat, I've gotten to know Jeff Wall, who is the founder of both Black Hat and DEF CON. Jeff, in the early days of Black Hat, was known as Dark Tangent, because nobody used their real name. And that's changed over the years, where Jeff is now one of the advisors to CISA. And instead of hiding from government, they're helping government set the cyber standards. And I said, Jeff, I'm supposed to teach this course on ethics. I went through the Black Hat library. There was one book I found. It was on ethical machines. And is this the only book? It's about AI ethics. And you will read a lot about AI ethics if you're looking, if you're interested in the subject. Read Blackman has a very good book, and I'd recommend it. And AI ethics is a small part of the digital world, of the cyber world. It's a hot topic right now, but it's just a really small part. And I said, Jeff, is there anything else that you would recommend for the students to read? And he said, yes. There's a book by a New York Times writer, and I hope some of you have read this book, but it's Nicole Perlroth. This is How They Tell Me the World Ends. And that sounded familiar. The name sounded familiar. And I thought, where do I know this? I had not read the book. But what Jeff told me is there is an ethical issue in every chapter of her book. And if I was teaching, he said, I would give the students the book and challenge them, find the ethical issue. Now, students like a problem. To me, it sounded like, where's Waldo? You know, here's this book, find the ethical issue. And a lot of the class was debating, is the ethical issue I found more important than the ethical issue you found? And I started reading the book before class started, so I'd have some idea what we were assigning the students. And in chapter 2, it's about a meeting of speakers at a conference in South Beach, Miami during the winter. And I remember meeting Dale Peterson, and I was speaking at this S4 conference, and him warning me about this dinner. There's a New York Times reporter going to be at the dinner, thought you might want to know. And I said, absolutely, Dale, I'll make sure I'll sit on the other end of the table. I did not want to show up in the New York Times the next morning. All right? So, sure enough, Nicole describes this dinner in South Beach with her 2 hackers from Italy, a German expert in OT, Ralph Langer, who every time I've come to S4, I've seen Ralph. I didn't see him here yet this year, but he could be hiding in the wings somewhere, or he could be off in Germany helping save the government. Ralph could be anywhere. But she writes about it. Dale was at the dinner too. She doesn't call out Dale's name in the book, but she might as well have, having described the dinner. And in the dinner, she's determined to find out, who do you work for? Who pays the bills? And she's very subtle about it, as some reporters who are very artful and crafty can get you to tell them things you never would have told them otherwise. And the way she asks the questions and the way she brings it up, every time she'd ask, they want to talk about how good the food is. And honestly, the food's pretty good in South Beach, Miami. I've yet to have a bad meal here. And so they divert, they deflect, they stall. And finally, when they were talking about, Nicole, you really should try the salmon, Ralph slams his fist on the table and says, stop talking about the friggin' salmon and tell them who you work for. Well, that scared the guys. They got up and left. But the answer's obvious. They didn't want to say. And the options are, do you work for the government? You work for the Italian government? Do you work for the US government? You work for some other country? Maybe the Chinese or the Russians, the Iranians, or the Koreans? Who do you work for? And if it's not the government, do you work for industry? Is it, somebody in Italy you work for? Is it Siemens or SAP or Rockwell, Honeywell? Who's paying your bills? And then maybe it's none of the above. Maybe they come from Sicily, and there's a big organization in Sicily that is in the criminal world. Maybe they're working for the criminal element, and they just don't want it said. And I suspect, having been at this dinner and listening to these guys, they're working for anybody that'll pay them. Think of the small business structure. You're just trying to stay afloat. You're trying to make payroll. You're trying to put food on the table. And if there's somebody that's willing to pay you for your expertise, are you going to say, no, I don't do that? I have my limits. I have my standards. I have my ethics. They will not allow me to work if you're going to apply this to break laws. So that was kind of the starting of how I got into the ethics world and started talking about ethics. And HP is a very ethical company, and so they supported me coming out on the stage and actually speaking what I think. But it starts with the class on what do you think about espionage? What's ethical about espionage? And I've got a bunch of students, most of which are mid-career, working in government or for government or a company that gets their pay from government. And you ask them, do you think it's ethical for the NSA, National Security Agency, to spy on citizens from overseas? And they kind of, well, maybe, it depends, who knows. Is it ethical for them to spy on Chinese citizens? Oh, yeah, somebody needs to look after what they're doing, and somebody needs to protect us from people in China trying to steal our intellectual property. That's ethical. That's okay. That's permissible. Well, is it ethical for the NSA to spy on British citizens, French citizens, German, our friends, our allies? That's, well, maybe if they're doing anything bad, or if we think they're doing bad, or we want to check on them occasionally, maybe that's okay, not universal agreement. But the final question is it ethical for the Chinese government to spy on US citizens for their own national security? And universally, the answer is, hell no. That's not fair. They can't do that. Well, wait a minute. If it's ethical for us to protect our country by checking out what everybody else is doing, why is it not ethical for the Chinese to do that? It sets off some bells. So, I'll call that session and that week, of course, Spy versus Spy. Any of you who used to read Mad Magazine in their youth? I'm old enough to remember that. That's really what's going on. Who's spying on who? And are you really using that information for national security or not? And I've worked in my career with NSA. They're great people, great U.S. citizens doing great things for our country. And to everything I saw in the years I was there, they're following the law. They're running by the rules. If they're collecting on a foreign citizen and a U.S. person shows up, they turn it off. They stop collecting. Why? Because they're not allowed by law to collect on U.S. citizens. Now, the FBI can. So is it ethical for the U.S. FBI to spy on U.S. citizens? And the general answer is yes, if. Yes, if they're following the law that allows them to do that. Do they have a warrant? Have they gone to a judge and got permission? Is there a third party overseeing the collections that they're doing? And so that's a whole ethical issue that's engaged. Back to the AI ethics question in the book here, it's very clear, without data, there is no AI. You need hardware, you need software. That's not sufficient. You also need data. And most of the ethical issues in AI aren't with the hardware, seldom with the algorithm. They generally is, how do you collect the data? Were you biased in your collection? Did you train on a certain set of data that would give you certain answers? Did you manipulate the data to give you the results you wanted? Academia has that issue. That's why they do peer reviews. If an academic uses data in a certain way to prove his theory, but it was a biased approach, they're thrown out. They're disgraced. And they're found out by peers that will do the same research with their own data and come up with different conclusions, saying, wait a minute, what you just figured doesn't mesh with my research. And so the AI ethics is really dependent on how you collect data. I know an old master sergeant in the Air Force who was out of San Antonio, where most of their cyber work is done, and he retired and he started a company, AATD. And I was trying to figure out his name and how he got AATD, and was it, his first two initials and initials of his partner or something. Couldn't figure it out. Finally asked him. I said, hey, Master Sergeant, how did you come up with the name for your company? He said, Tommy, it's simple. It's all about the data, AATD. He was exactly right, and I love that term. I think of it frequently because at the end of the day, it is all about the data. So in the OT world, you want to think about ethical policy and how you make ethical decisions for autonomous vehicles. We had a great talk earlier this week about autonomy and autonomous AI. But if you knew there were 40,000 deaths on U.S. highway last year, not 2023, because they still get that data collected, but 2022, 40,000. There used to be up to 50,000 deaths on our highways. So it's cut back. I think COVID probably had some help with that. People weren't driving as much, so people weren't dying as often. But if you could prove by these autonomous cars in San Francisco and some other cities, saw some pictures of those earlier this year, that you could reduce the number of deaths in America to 10,000, what's the ethical thing to do? If you were a congressman or a senator, would you propose a bill to say people can no longer drive? We're killing too many Americans. Hadn't been done yet, but the students will come up with many questions and blocks of, well, how do you know? How can you prove it to me that you only lose 10,000? What if you lose 15,000? Okay, so we don't save 30,000 lives. We only save 25,000. I'll give you 15. Well, what about 30,000? Okay, so we only save 10,000 lives. Is it still? where do you draw the line? And if I could save 10,000 lives today and 20,000 lives next year and 30,000 the year after, because the AI, autonomous driving, will get better. The more situations it runs into, the more experience it has, then how do you know? Well, you don't know. We make a lot of decisions in life when we don't have the facts to accurately predict the outcome. But you have instincts, and your instincts tell you this is probably a better way to go. But revolutionary, life-changing, structural differences, I think it's going to happen one day. And it happens solely because people in our country value life. And there's a tremendous number of lives that could be saved. DEF CON last year, I learned a lot from an experienced hacker who retired, having made his millions of dollars in the community, and he was in his 50s, but he'd had his fun, made his millions, and now he's retired. But he's feeling the twinge of guilt. He's feeling kind of bad about how he made his money. He wants to give back to those he's harmed. I call him, I don't remember his last name, but he's very open about it. I call him the vigilante, because what he's doing now for fun, he's going in to websites of the hackers, of the ransomware experts. He knows who they are because he used to be part of it, and he's shutting them down. He knows how to get inside their skin, get inside their networks, and own their networks. And then he lets them know, I've got you. It's kind of a game, and he's winning the game, and they're not stopping him. And to me, that's a vigilante. He's proving that he can shut them down. And at the end of his talk, he asked the question, is this ethical? And I bring that to the students. Is a vigilante protecting your assets in your company, onto your home, your photos of your family? Is this guy preventing ransomware to happening to you? Is he doing it ethically? Now, his argument is, I'm not making any money on this. I'm doing this to help others. I'm able to help others because of what I knew and what I learned and what I did. And he thinks he's completely ethical. But he's breaking law. There's laws that prevent him from doing this, and he does it anyway. The vigilante breaks laws for the good of the community. So where do you stand? Is it ethical for the vigilante to shut down malware sites? You know, I kind of wish they'd do more of it. Might put me out of business, but it would sure help the world at large. But is it ethical? Breaking laws just doesn't seem ethical to me. And it's a hard question. Now, a harder question may be the engineer. Any engineers in the room that will confess to being a hardcore engineer? I was a mechanical engineer in my youth and nuclear engineer when I was driving submarines. There's a process you go through. In fact, I just met two ladies from Poland at lunch who work for Accenture, and we're talking about their engineering background that got them into the cyber world because of the process an engineer goes through to solve problems. And whether you're a chemical engineer, a cyber engineer, mechanical, electrical, doesn't matter. It's a similar process for all those fields. And there was an engineer in an unnamed city who was designing a skyscraper and using all the modern digital tools of finite element analysis for stress and strain and structural integrity and computational fluid dynamics that was looking at the different dynamic events that could happen to a building in the middle of a city. And the conclusion he came up with was that if we bolted the frame together, instead of welding it all together, we could save $50 million in our bid and make the company a lot of money. And the senior people in the company looked at his analysis, thought, great idea, let's put the bolts in, save the city $50 million, let's make the company a lot of money. And they went for it, they built it, the people moved in, and the attendees filled the building up. And then somebody asked him, how did you calculate wind stress in your CFD model? And he thought about it and realized, you know, I might have forgotten that part. Humans make mistakes. You know, humans can go to malware sites and find out they've infected the whole company with malware. And he realized it. So what do you do? What's the ethical thing to do when you realize you didn't do a calculation that you should have thought of? You know, well, I mean, you guys know the right answer. You go back and do the calculation to see, would it have made a difference? Would you have come up with the same conclusion? Would you have still been able to support, we'll bolt this together and still have a factor of 2 of safety for the worst case scenario? And sometimes the scenarios are worse than the worst case. You can't accurately predict the scenario, but you usually make it worse than you ever think could happen in 100 years and hope that's good enough. Well, he did. He did the right thing. He went back and recalculated. He put the wind stress in there, and the answer was, we no longer have a factor of 2 safety. In fact, it's closer to 1. If we get a 50-mile-per-hour wind through this city, this building could fall down and kill all the inhabitants in it. So now what do you do? Now that you have more information, it's an economic concept in game theory, the expected value of perfect information. Now this young engineer realizes that, gee, this is a problem. What do I do now? Do I tell my boss and he fires me because I was an idiot not including this to begin with? Or does the boss worry that, oh, holy smokes, I approved this thing. Why didn't I ask the question? Where's the wind stress calculation? And then you go to the CEO or the president of the company and say, hey, sir, or hey, ma'am, we got a $50 million problem here. We've got to go back and re-weld this frame and take every tenant out of the building, and it's going to take about a year with no income and cost us about $50 million because we're not safe right now. So what would you do? Well, you like your job. You like to continue work in the architectural field. You've got digital skills that apply that, can help. And you've learned something. You're better today than you were a year ago. But if this is found out, you'll probably never work in the field again. You'll have to change profession. Word gets around in small communities. But he did the right thing. Went to the boss. Said, hey, we got a big problem. And it may be 50 million. And the boss says, well, has a decision. Do you tell the city? Do you tell the inspectors who approved the plans to start the building? Do you tell them we had a miscalculation? Do you say, hey, we're not a big company, but we'll spend what we have to do this right, to rebuild it? And the boss made the right decision. Went back to the mayor, confessed the problem, said we're at fault, we're liable. Before anybody gets hurt, we're going to get them all out, and we're going to fix this the right way. Commendable. You wish everybody followed rules like that. Do the right thing, even when it hurts. Now, the end of the story is pretty good, because the city said, hey, look, we know you didn't mean to. This was not malicious. We know that people make mistakes, and your employee made a big one. We're going to help fund the $50 million. So the company stayed afloat. They actually gained business because of their ethical stance in telling the city, hey, we screwed up. We want to make it right. Became something other people wanted to use that firm because they became convinced that they would do it right. So a very good outcome. Anyway, I'm running out of time. I've got 100 other scenarios we covered in 14 weeks of class. Happy to stick around at the wrap-up or even after. I don't drink beer, but I'll be at the beer bash, so you're welcome to come approach me with your situation. We'll get it into class next fall. We're going to teach it again. And I just ask you, are you ready? Are you taking a stand to do the right thing at the right time. Thank you.